Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're taking a seriously fascinating deep dive into a comprehensive overview of Chapter 8 on Object Relations Family Counseling. We're going to explore how these dense, historical, psychoanalytic theories, the kind of stuff that sounds incredibly academic and dry on paper, actually apply to messy, real-world family systems. It's an amazing journey from the very origins of psychology all the way to modern therapeutic practices, and honestly, it is absolutely going to change how you view your own family dynamics. Let's get into it. Okay, let's dive into this Chapter 8 overview. Here's our roadmap. First up, the roots of psychoanalysis. Second, evolution of object relations. Third, the garden metaphor. Fourth, the counselor's role. And finally, we'll analyze a real clinical case, the Quest family.
Starting right off with Section 1, the roots of psychoanalysis. So, to understand where family counseling is today, we really have to look at its roots with Sigmund Freud. Freud developed what's known as drive psychology. Basically, he believed human behavior started as impulsive desires to satisfy biological needs. Things like hunger or aggression. And the whole goal was just tension reduction for the individual. Now contrast that with modern object relations, which focuses entirely on the family system, attachment, and external relationships. In fact, here's a wild detail. While Freud is absolutely the father of modern psychology and unconscious development, there is actually no evidence he ever worked directly with families. He was hyper-focused on the individual, whereas modern object relations focuses on the entire system.
Moving right along to Section 2, evolution of object relations.
So, how exactly did we get from Freud's individual focus to treating the whole family? Well, after Freud passed away in 1939, psychoanalysis just exploded into multiple different models. If we trace the timeline, it starts with Freud's drive psychology. Then we move to pioneers like Melanie Klein, who stayed close to Freud's ideas but worked directly with children, and W.R.D. Fairbairn. Fairbairn is a huge deal here. He's often considered the first pure object relations theorist because he believed children are inherently trying to relate to other people from birth, not just trying to satisfy biological drives. Then John Bowlby came along with attachment theory, laying the evolutionary groundwork. And finally, all of this lands in the hands of modern practitioners like David and Jill Scharf, who developed the foremost model of object relations family counseling that we use today. Okay, let's de-jargonize this core concept for a second. What actually is object relations? Well, in this context, an object isn't a physical thing like a chair or a table. It's a person, or rather, a child's internal image of a person. Humans internalize different aspects of their early caregivers. Because an infant needs and desires their parent so much, they'll actually mentally split that parent into good and bad aspects. They internalize the bad aspects as part of themselves, leaving the outside object, the parent, to remain entirely good. It's wild, right? These internal, unconscious images then act like a hidden blueprint, secretly dictating our relationship patterns for the rest of our lives.
Which brings us to Section 3, the garden metaphor.
Now let's look at a brilliant visual anchor used by David and Jill Scharf, who are, as I mentioned, absolute trailblazers in this field. They use this wonderful analogy to describe their work. They write, "The environmental needs for clean air and water are comparable to the social provisions for family health. The fences around the garden protecting it from invasion compared to the family boundaries. The fertilization and care of the ground are comparable to the family's shared holding capacity." I absolutely love this because it makes the roles so clear. The family members themselves are the actual gardeners, and the counselor, they are just a horticultural consultant brought in when the gardeners get stuck in patterns that are ruining their crops.
So, as this so-called horticultural consultant, what are the counselor's actual goals? Well, the main goal is to reintegrate lost, repressed, or projected parts of the self back into individual family members. See, we often project the parts of ourselves that we just don't want to deal with onto our spouses or our kids. The counselor steps in to help the family rework these defensive projections, clarify what each individual actually needs, and ultimately build a supportive environment so the family can get right back to effective gardening entirely on their own.
Now, this all sounds really great in theory, doesn't it? But imagine a family walking into a clinic. They're yelling, they're disconnected, and they are just totally overwhelmed. So how does a counselor actually manage a family in complete chaos to achieve these goals?
That takes us directly into Section 4, the counselor's role.
Managing these chaotic dynamics requires a highly disciplined clinical approach. The very first thing a counselor absolutely has to do is create what is called a holding environment. The counselor literally has to absorb the chaos in the room. They contain it and make the space emotionally safe enough to experience. They do this by taking a stance of optimal visibility.
meaning they reveal just enough of themselves to show they're present and working to understand, but they remain enough of a blank screen that the family can project their needs onto them. It's a space where needed attachment is actively modeled.
So the crucial point is how the counselor actually intervenes. They don't just sit back and talk about history. First, they track effect, meaning they watch like a hawk for live emotional cues. A dirty look, a sudden interruption, a flare of temper right there in the room. Second, they analyze the transference happening in the moment, using their own internal reactions, which is called countertransference, to figure out what the family is feeling. And finally, they deliver an interpretation. They share their deep understanding of the pattern happening right in the here and now so the family can suddenly see the invisible forces driving their conflict.
All right, let's bring it all together in Section 5, Analyzing the Quest Family.
To really ground all this theory in reality, let's look at a messy, real-world clinical application from our source text. A common tool used here is a 3-generation genogram, which maps out family history visually. Imagine a family tree where squares represent males and circles represent females. When mapping the Quest family, visual cues, like shading in certain shapes, are used to indicate historical issues, like a generational problem with alcohol. The counselor maps out these historical traumas, addictions, and relationships to fully understand the unconscious blueprints, those object relations we talked about, that the parents, Paul and Jane Quest, are secretly bringing into their current marriage.
The clinical reality of their first session is incredibly intense. Jan and Paul have 4 children, 2 older biological girls and 2 younger adopted boys, ages 6 and 4, who have survived terrible abuse in their young lives. Jane brings them all in, desperately hoping to get help for the boys, but the counselor insists on seeing the whole family system. Paul is super reluctant and distant. The counselor immediately senses the marriage itself is severely stressed and their parental leadership is literally on the verge of total collapse. To actually help the abused boys, the counselor knows they can't just fix the kids. They have to explore Paul and Jane's own parental histories. They have to understand how Paul's internalized relationship with his own mother and father is preventing him from stepping up, so he and Jane can finally function as a team.
And that brilliantly illustrates the true power of object relations family counseling. It is never just about the surface argument. It is always about the deep, internalized blueprints of our past quietly dictating our present, which leaves us with a pretty massive question to ponder. How might your own internalized objects, the unconscious images of your earliest childhood relationships, be secretly gardening the dynamics of your family today? Take a close look at your own holding environment. You might be completely surprised at what you find. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.